the third proper expansion to Rattus, and I'm excluding the mini expansions and promos there, is Rattus Mercatus. Now, this adds markets and traders to the Rattus game, a whole extra sort of stage that you go through each turn where you're taking goods, and then if you have majorities on spaces, you can then trade those goods for money, which is going to score you points, or with some of the class cards, you can use money to do various other things, or the class cards indeed can give you money for other things that you do. So we've got 12 new class cards in here, 2 of each of the original 6 classes, not the Islamic class that came in the second expansion, Africanus. So we've got a set of class cards equivalent to the same number, at least, that we had in the Pied Piper expansion, which added a lot of variety to the base game a few years ago. So Mercatus does change the way the game plays, but is that for the better? Let's have a little look. In Rattus Mercatus, we use the basic board as normal, except that we place one of these tokens on each region, and these represent the type of good that the region will deal in. So we have lumber and salt and fish and cloth up here, and they have a grey side on the back of them. The way that the game, this adds an extra element of strategy in the game, and there's actually an additional little phase in the game, which is that on your turn, as well as moving the plague and placing cubes as you normally would, you can also take a token from the supply, if there's one available. So there's a supply by the side of the board where these tokens are placed. You can take one on your turn. It doesn't cost you anything. You just take it and put it in front of yourself. And then if it comes to your turn and you take one and it's the last one of that type in the supply, then there's a sale phase. So players can sell off these tokens. Now, every token that they sell off gives them 3 coins. So we have a bunch of coins that come with the game. Now, I mean, that sounds fairly easy. Well, hang on a minute. If we're all taking one and then we're all able to sell them for 3 coins, we're all getting the same. And that is sort of true, except that you can only sell to a region where you have the majority of the cubes. So if I wanted to sell fish, I've got to have the majority in a fish region. And if I wanted to sell 2 fish tokens, I've got to have the majority in 2 fish regions. So it starts to drive your choices of where you're placing your cubes, because you need to have majorities in the region where you have these tokens. And what's the money for? Well, essentially points. At the end of the game, 5 money is going to equal 1 point. I believe it's 5 money for 1 point. I'll quickly look that up and just double check that I've got that correct. Yeah, 5 money is the equivalent of 1 cube on the board, so it's 1 point. Money can also be used in other ways when dealing with the various different class cards. The money can be spent to, add additional cubes onto the board or do various things in the game, as you would expect in Rattus. There's also additional ways to earn money using these different powers. So most of the class cards in Mercatus relate to these trade tokens and to money, and use that ability in various different ways. So if you're going to use these cards, you need to be using the Mercatus rules. There are 12 class cards in this set, the same amount as you get in the Pied Piper expansion, and that's 6 of each of the original class types. No Islamic cards, so it doesn't sit quite so comfortably with the Africanus expansion, although there is a fix for that with a mini expansion called Arabian Traders, which I'll look at in a separate video. I'm not going to go through what each of these cards does. They're quite fairly complex, some of them, more complex than the other expansions, the stuff that's in the Pied Piper expansion, for example. Nothing massively complex, but every little added bit of complexity in this game slows it down a little bit. There certainly is an element of added strategy in the game, and as you can see, our artwork and components are of just the same fantastic quality as we've seen in all the other expansions and the base game. I mean, remember, this is Alexander Roche. He's the same guy who illustrated the game Troyes and Tournai and Bruxelles. So he's a fantastic artist, really distinctive style, and once again the feel of these cards is just lovely. I mean, look at this fantastic Gravedigger card here. You know, it's good stuff. So that is the core of Mercatus. So let's see what we think about the game. Now, with the second and the third expansions to Rattus, the designers have been trying to add strategy to the game. With the Africanus expansion, this one here, we saw the addition of region cards, which gave you extra points at the end of the game for having majorities in certain regions. And oddly, Mercatus pretty much does the same thing. We're still looking for majorities in certain regions, but those regions are determined by what they will trade with, what goods they will trade with. But the impact is the same, and actually it works better with Mercatus. It's more thematic, there's more reason behind why we're looking for majorities in those regions, rather than just drawing a card which tells us which regions we should be working with. And that money which you gain, it's not just straightforward points, it can be used in various ways throughout the game. So that makes Mercatus a little more thematic and a little more interesting than the strategic stuff in Africanus. However, as I said in my Africanus review, Rattus is not a game that rewards great strategy. You can play very strategically, you can think for a long time about your turn, but ultimately the game is going to come down to what happens in that final round when all the rats are activated and damage limitation. And so I'm not saying that a good player won't win at Rattus, they probably will. But it is not a game of deep strategy. It's a game of a lot of randomness and just enjoying the ride, really, and seeing where you end up. So throwing those strategic elements in feels a little misleading. It's a bit of a facade of strategy because ultimately it has not that much impact, and players will spend quite a lot of time thinking about these things, and that can be quite frustrating when they don't pay off. That said, I would play with the Rattus expansion. I like the tokens, they're nice and tactile. The phase that they add, it doesn't add a lot of time to the game, a little bit. The cards add a layer of complexity, so I wouldn't go for this with beginners of the game, but with regular players, there's a lot of nice variety, and it does give you a little bit more to think about. So there's tons of class cards as well, and it's always nice to have more class cards, and 12 in one expansion is a fantastic new addition to the game. So for me, Mercatus is a decent expansion. It doesn't quite achieve what it sets out to do, but it does give you a whole load of new variety and a slightly different way to play the game. So that is Rattus Mercatus.